Man of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious, for as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. What you worship as unknown, I now proclaim you. This moment, Paul speaking before the Areopagus in Athens, is often remembered as a stroke of rhetorical genius, transforming a gesture of pagan awe into a platform for Christian revelation. But beneath the sermon lies something deeper, a yearning, a recognition. Even in the heart of the polytheistic world, among temples to Apollo, Athena, and Dionysus, there was still space for something unnamed, something greater, unseen, unrepresented, a God who was not just unfamiliar, but unknowable. And Paul wasn't the only one who noticed. In fact, this unnamed God, this sense of the singular divine, was not alien to the ancient world. The eventual success of Christianity in the Roman Empire didn't happen in a vacuum. It wasn't simply the result of Constantine's conversion or a single imperial decree. Rather, it emerged from a long and complex transformation, a gradual shift in the religious imagination of the empire. Today, we begin our journey into the margins, with a group you may never have heard of. They called themselves those who worship the Most High.
I'm Andy Altshuler, and this is Echoes of Heresy, a podcast about spiritual descent and divergent beliefs across time and tradition.
Monotheism is often imagined as a radical break, a clean departure from the chaotic pantheons of the ancient world. But that's only part of the truth. Beneath the surface of polytheistic religion, one finds a quieter, more contemplative current, a search for unity beneath the divine plurality. In Egypt, we encounter the concept of the neter, or nature, a word usually translated as God, but perhaps better understood as divine principle or force. As the British Egyptologist E.A. Wallace Budge noted, the Egyptians didn't always think of their gods as distinct personalities. A nature could be a function of the divine, an aspect of a greater spiritual reality. The multiplicity of Egyptian deities may have concealed or revealed an underlying unity. More explicitly, the pharaoh Akhenaten in the 14th century BCE attempted what some call the world's first monotheistic revolution. He abolished the traditional gods of Egypt and proclaimed Aten, the sun disk, as the sole deity. No anthropomorphic images, no pluralism, just light, pure and absolute. Though his revolution collapsed shortly after his death, it remains a striking precedent, a state-backed attempt to reduce the divine to a singular, visible principle. In Rome, there was the idea of the noumen, an impersonal divine presence that infused objects, places, and even people. The term doesn't suggest a god with personality or myth, but a force, a presence, a will. One could say a concept of grace flowed through this notion long before grace was ever theologized. And then there were the pre-Socratics, and early Greek thinkers who looked past myth and ritual and asked, what lies behind everything? Thales said water, Anaximander spoke of apeiron, the boundless, the indefinite. These weren't deities, strictly speaking, but they were the first abstract attempts to locate the source, the one behind the many. Plato sharpened this search. For him, true reality lay not in the shifting forms of the world, but in the ideas, eternal and unchanging. Above all of them stood the idea of the good, the absolute, radiant source from which all being derives. And finally, Aristotle gave us the unmoved mover, a perfect, necessary being who causes all motion without itself being moved. Not a god in the Homeric sense, but a self-thinking thought, complete in itself, eternal and singular. So long before Paul spoke at the Areopagus, long before the Gospels were written or the creeds codified, the pagan world had already begun to contemplate unity, to imagine the divine as singular, abstract, even ineffable. This was not monotheism as the Hebrews knew it, but it was a crack in the wall, a movement towards the one. The philosophical shift in the Mediterranean world didn't happen in isolation. It was shaped deeply by the currents flowing from the east. In Persia, the Zoroastrian tradition brought a stark dualism. Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, pitted against Angra-Mainyu, the spirit of chaos and destruction. Though not fully monotheistic, Zoroastrianism marked a dramatic shift from mythological polytheism toward cosmic, ethical tension. Ahura Mazda was not one god among many, but the highest principle of order and truth. Zoroastrian dualism, particularly in its later forms, leaned increasingly toward monotheism in practice, with evil seen not as a god, but as a corruption of the good. This sharpened sense of moral metaphysics would later echo in Jewish apocalyptic thought, in Christian theology, and in the subterranean currents of sectarian belief that hovered just outside orthodoxy. Then, of course, there was the Jewish diaspora. By the first centuries BCE and CE, Jewish communities had spread throughout Asia Minor, Egypt, and the Greek-speaking world. Their monotheism was stark and uncompromising. No idols, no intermediaries. And yet they did not live in isolation. Greek-speaking pagans, many of them philosophers or seekers, encountered Jewish scripture in translation, debated in shared public spaces, and sometimes attended synagogue without becoming full converts. These individuals were often called God-fearers, or theosebei in Greek. Gentiles who respected the God of Israel, admired Jewish ethical teachings, and adopted certain practices like Sabbath observance or dietary restrictions, but without taking on full covenantal obligations, like circumcision. This porous zone between synagogue and street, between Hellenism and Hebraism, gave rise to new forms of religious identity. It is here, in this threshold space, neither fully pagan nor fully Jewish, that the Hypsistarians may have emerged. They were not the only ones, but they remain among the most enigmatic, and they remind us the monotheistic turn in antiquity was not a revolution of swords or creeds. It was a slow, complicated, multi-sourced evolution where philosophy, culture, politics, and personal yearning converged. We call them Hypsistarians, but they themselves likely knew no such name. What they worshipped, they called upon in prayer, was Hypsistos Theos, the Most High God. The term Hypsistos, meaning Most High, is not unique to this group. It has a deep and varied presence in the ancient Mediterranean world. In Greek translation of Hebrew scriptures, especially in Septuagint, Hypsistos is the rendering of El Elyon, a name for the God of Israel. In Psalms and in Book of Daniel, the Lord is praised as the God Most High, and in the mouths of Gentiles, that phrase took on new life. In Hellenistic and Roman religious culture, Hypsistos appears widely in inscriptions and dedications, especially in Asia Minor, northern Syria, and Magna Graecia. These inscriptions often come from individuals whose names are unmistakably Greek or Roman. They invoke Theos Hypsistos in language that blends Jewish monotheism, Stoic natural theology, and local pagan forms. One such inscription from Pantikapeum in Crimea reads, "To Theos Hypsistos, who hears the prayers of the just and punishes the wicked." Another from Tralles in western Anatolia is carved into a rock altar, "To Theos Hypsistos, protector of the city, giver of oracles and guardian of the laws." A bilingual inscription from Philippi invokes Deus Summus in Latin and Theos Hypsistos in Greek interchangeably. Here we can see a theological convergence, monotheistic terminology used by polytheists who are, perhaps, moving toward a simpler, more exalted image of divinity. The earliest mention of a distinct group associated with this title comes from the Christian theologian Gregory of Nazianzus, writing in the 4th century. In his oration 18, he tells us that his own father, a landowner and local notable in Cappadocia, was a member of a group that worshipped the Hypsistos before converting to Christianity. Gregory describes them as a sort of halfway position between paganism and Judaism, adopting many Jewish customs, but stopping short of full Torah observance. There are other ancient references that may point to the same phenomenon. The Pseudo-Clementine recognitions mention Gentile monotheists who revered the God of Israel but rejected Jewish law, perhaps a reference to Theosebi, or groups like Hypsistarians. Eusebius of Caesarea also describes certain groups in Asia Minor and Syria who honored the one God without affiliating with synagogue or church. So who were these people? What unites these disparate sources, the inscriptions, the patristic testimonies, and the archaeological remains, is not a formal religion, but a shared impulse to affirm the one without rejecting all plurality, to worship the Most High while standing outside the boundaries of covenantal Judaism or Nicene Christianity. From the scarce sources we know, these worshippers lit fires on high places, simple hilltop sanctuaries, not monumental temples. There, under open skies, they offered flame instead of image. The Hypsistos was invisible, formless, and thus not to be represented. In this they shared a sensibility with Judaism, or perhaps inherited a local interpretation of it. Their cult was iconoclastic, in a sense, but not necessarily exclusive. There is no hard evidence that they actively denied the existence of other divine beings. Rather, their worship singled out one God as supreme, above the rest, the one most worthy of reverence and prayer. This ambiguity makes it difficult to determine whether they were strictly monotheists in the Jewish or Christian sense, or more like henotheists, elevating one deity without denying the existence of others. Some inscriptions suggest moral concerns. Hypsistos is praised as the just God, the punisher of the wicked, and the one who hears the prayers of the righteous. Others suggest Stoic or Platonic influence, identifying the Most High with reason, nature, or cosmos itself. As for rituals, our best reconstructions are cautious. The rejection of idols is certain, so is the prominence of fire. Some epigraphic hints, especially from Cappadocia and the Bosporan kingdom, suggest abstention from pork or wine, or a holy day of rest. It's been speculated that they observed a form of the Sabbath, though not necessarily on Saturday, and without the full legal strictures of Jewish halacha. There was no priesthood, no centralized hierarchy. These were likely loose-knit communities, urban, literate, and eclectic, united more by shared religious sentiment than by doctrine or scripture. They occupied a borderland, and it is precisely in this in-between that their religious imagination came alive. They were part of a larger current in the Greco-Roman world, a monotheisizing trend, if you will, in which all the polytheisms were gradually giving way to a simpler, more abstract visions of the divine. As I said, these trends didn't begin or end with Constantine's conversion. They were already underway in the centuries before and continued long after. The Hypsistarians, however fleeting or fragmentary, were one expression of this transformation. They remind us that the story of monotheism isn't clean or sudden. It is layered, partial, and always in negotiation. They also remind us that real people, men and women, will never know by name, once stood on hills beneath the open sky, offering fire to a god they could not see, but still called Most High. We know they lit fires on high places, not just as offerings, but as symbols. Fire for them was not merely a tool of sacrifice, it was presence, a sign of purity, transformation, ascent. In this they echoed other traditions, the ever-burning fires of Zoroastrianism, where flame embodies the very essence of divine truth, which was called Asha in ancient Persian, and the Stoic cosmos, where the fire is the primal element, reason manifest in nature, the logos that animates all things. We can't say for certain that the Hypsistarians read Zeno or revered Ahura Mazda, but they moved in a world where ideas traveled, where ritual forms echoed across boundaries. In their fires we see a convergence, the philosophical fire of the Stoics, the sacred fire of the Persians, and the consuming and revealing fire of the Hebrew prophets. It was not a god, but it was how the god was honored, and perhaps how he was perceived. There are also faint whispers of a theology of the soul. Some inscriptions invoke Theos Hypsistos as a judge of the dead, suggesting belief in an afterlife. Others hint at resurrection language, while some reflect the more Hellenistic idea of soul immortality, the release of the rational self from the body's prison. We don't have doctrine, but we have gesture, language that leans towards continuity beyond death and moral consequence. Whether they imagined bodily resurrection or spiritual ascent is unclear. Perhaps they didn't distinguish them sharply. They lived in a time when such questions were still fluid, where Jewish, Christian, Platonic, and mystery religion models of the afterlife overlapped and blurred. What seems clear that they believed the Most High was not just a god of this world, but of what came after. Socially and culturally, the Hypsistarians occupied a liminal zone. They were what scholars of religion now call a boundary community, neither fully within the synagogue nor comfortably at home in the temples of Olympus. From the Jewish point of view, they were God-fearers at a distance. From the Roman perspective, they were eccentric monotheists who crucially did not upset the social order. Indeed, their existence likely fostered dialogue, cultural and religious, across boundaries. In cities like Tralles, Sardis, and Cappadocian Nazianzus, where Jews, pagans, and early Christians all lived side by side, such groups acted as cultural mediators. Their moral monotheism could appeal to philosophically inclined pagans. Their respect for Jewish traditions won admiration, and their austere simplicity may have resonated even with early Christians. In this, they were part of a broader phenomenon, individuals and groups who stood just outside major traditions, borrowing from them, bridging them, or resisting neat affiliation. Were they tolerated? For the most part, yes. The Roman Empire was surprisingly flexible in religious matters. As long as public order and imperial dignity were maintained, the Theos Hypsistos inscriptions rarely attracted persecution. Their prayers invoked justice, not revolution. Their hilltop sanctuaries were no threat to the civic cults. But there were limits. Roman authorities could tolerate unusual worship, but not seditious separation. Groups that refused to sacrifice to the emperor, or who organized too tightly outside the traditional frameworks, sometimes drew suspicion. If the Hypsistarians, like Jews or Christians, rejected imperial offerings, they may have faced scrutiny. Still, there were moments when that difference became dangerous. One of the clearest came under Emperor Valerian in the middle of the 3rd century, a time of crisis for the empire. Rome was at war on multiple fronts. Plagues and rebellions racked the provinces. In that chaos, Valerian sought to stabilize the empire the way emperors often did, through religious conformity. In a series of edicts around 257-258 CE, Valerian ordered the suppression of what he called foreign cults, especially those seen as disloyal or subversive. Christian bishops were arrested, assemblies were banned, and while Jews were not the primary target, any religious group that refused to participate in the imperial rites to offer sacrifice for the emperor's well-being could come under suspicion. It's here in the vague margins of imperial suspicion that the Hypsistarians may have found themselves vulnerable. They were not Christian, but they rejected the gods of the temples. They were not Jewish, but they honored the Sabbath, avoided pork, and called upon a god whose name sounded suspiciously Hebrew. They didn't offer incense at the imperial altar and prayed to Theos Hypsistos, not Divus Augustus. It is possible, perhaps even likely, that some Hypsistarian communities were caught up in this dragnet, not systematically persecuted, as Christians were, but pushed further to the edge, harassed, pressured to conform. There is no direct record of crackdowns on Hypsistarians, but their invisibility in later sources may hint at suppression or absorption. As Christianity gained power and redefined orthodoxy, many such ambiguous groups were either converted, marginalized, or condemned. The Codex Theodosianus and other 4th-5th century laws against heresy and unsanctioned assemblies likely swept up groups like theirs, indistinct, neither here nor there, and therefore suspect. And so they vanished, not because they rebelled, not because they failed, but because their ambiguity, once their strength, became untenable in the age of creeds and councils. And yet, the memory lingers, and the name Hypsistos carved into stone, in the firelight of forgotten sanctuaries, in the uneasy admiration of a son describing his father's former faith, a faith he no longer followed, but could not quite forget. These are the echoes they left behind, not a doctrine, not a scripture, but a question. What does it mean to worship the Most High when the world demands you choose a side? Perhaps their influence didn't vanish completely, and we may have educated speculation about that. We may find echoes of the Hypsistarian spirit in the fire symbolism of early Christian monastics, and more enduringly in the liturgical traditions of Eastern Orthodoxy, where fire remains a powerful and living symbol of divine presence. From the ever-burning vigil lamps before icons to the paschal fire at Easter and the descent of the holy fire in Jerusalem, flame signifies purity, transformation, and the uncontainable mystery of God. This isn't fire as mere metaphor. It is treated with reverence, approached ritually, and even believed to carry miraculous qualities. In this light, we can understand Hypsistarian practices not as foreign or primitive, but as ancestral to later Christian sensibilities. More profoundly, the Hypsistarian refusal to define or depict God finds a striking parallel in apophatic theology, the so-called negative theology of figures like Gregory of Nyssa and Pseudo-Dionysius. In this tradition, God is not what we say He is, but what we cannot say. The divine is beyond names, beyond predicates. Hypsistos, in this sense, becomes not just most high, but utterly unknowable, a God who reveals himself by retreating from form. This yearning also resonates beyond Christianity. In early Islamic history, the Hanifs, pre-Islamic monotheists who rejected idolatry but did not align fully with Judaism or Christianity, bear a striking resemblance to the Hypsistarians. Like them, the Hanifs are difficult to define, existing mostly in retrospective texts and traditions. But they too sought a direct relationship with the Most High, stripped of intermediaries. Then, even in the Renaissance, thinkers like Nicholas of Cusa or Giordano Bruno explored ideas of an infinite, undivided source, the one beyond being, that mirrors ancient monotheizing tendencies. They likely never heard of Hypsistarians, but their intellectual kinship is unmistakable. Like many obscure religious groups of antiquity, the Hypsistarians vanished quietly. Their traces confined to inscriptions, passing references in patristic texts, and the architectural ghosts of hilltop sanctuaries remained almost invisible to historians for centuries. Interest revived in the late 19th and early 20th centuries as scholars began probing the religious pluralism of the Roman East. One of the early trailblazers was Frans Cumont, Belgian archaeologist and historian, whose work on the so-called Oriental religions cast a wide net over syncretic cults, and who saw in the Hypsistarians an important instance of pagan monotheism in transition. Another key figure was Gustav Mendel, whose documentation of Anatolian inscriptions helped lay the groundwork for understanding how widespread the term Hypsistos Theos really was. Both authors wrote in French, though major works by Frans Cumont are available in English translation. Regarding more recent scholarship, Stephen Mitchell, a leading authority on the religious landscape of Asia Minor, has worked extensively with epigraphic and archaeological evidence, particularly in Cappadocia and Galatia. He situates the Hypsistarians in the broader context of rural religious change under Roman imperial influence, examining how local cults were reshaped by new ideological pressures. Martin Hengel, meanwhile, focused on the interface between Judaism and Hellenistic culture, particularly in his seminal work Judaism and Hellenism. He didn't study the Hypsistarians directly, but his exploration of God-fearers, synagogue-adjacent Gentiles, monotheizing tendencies among pagans has been deeply influential in how scholars understand the broader environment from which groups like Hypsistarians emerged. Guy Strumza and David Frankfurter bringing perspectives from religious studies and anthropology have emphasized the fluidity and experimentation of late antique religiosity. Their framing of religious identity as negotiated, relational, and performative resonates strongly with most modern scholars who interpret the Hypsistarians. Less a formal sect, more a lived religious tendency that defied rigid categories. Not that the literature is abundant. However, there is definitely a number of books and articles worth checking. If this episode sparked questions, disagreements, or reflections, I want to hear them. You can reach me directly at echoesofheresy@gmail.com. Whether you're a scholar, seeker, skeptic, or just heretically curious, your voice is welcome here. Echoes of Heresy is a space for dialogue, and your thoughts help shape its future. If you enjoyed this episode, consider sharing it, rating it on your podcast app, or simply telling a friend. Word of mouth means more than algorithms ever could. Before we wrap up, it is worth to ask ourselves the question, what does the story of the Hypsistarians tell us? It reminds us that religion is rarely as clear-cut as doctrine would have us believe, that between temple and synagogue, between orthodoxy and heresy, there are always those who seek, who dwell in thresholds, in their imageless devotion, in their refusal to fully align with any single tradition. The Hypsistarians echo something deeply familiar today. How many of us describe ourselves as quote-unquote spiritual, but not religious? How many maintain cultural ties to a faith without strict adherence to its commandments? Even those who actively practice a religion may find their spiritual imaginations stirred by other traditions. We live again in an age of spiritual liminality. The lines between faiths are more porous than ever. Post-religious theism, perennial philosophy, and the rediscovery of Neoplatonic thought resonate with seekers who, like the Hypsistarians, reject rigid boundaries, yet remain devoted to the sacred. Their memory is not just a historical curiosity, it's a mirror. Their in-betweenness speak to the human longing for something higher, something beyond dogma. The unknowable God still calls. The flame still burns. Next time, we'll follow that flame eastward, to the ancient city of Edessa, where another boundary walker emerged. Bardesan, philosopher, poet, astrologer, and a Christian thinker whose ideas overlapped with, but also diverged from, Gnostic systems. A man whose vision of the cosmos challenged his contemporaries and whose fusion of Christianity and Eastern wisdom still sparks fascination today.